I'll begin calmly, the way it started for me, and ask you something simple. Where are you listening from right now? A room you know well, I imagine. A place you trust. That's how it was for me too, when I first realized something in my life didn't behave the way it should. I was living in a small apartment above a closed bookstore, the kind of place that still smelled faintly of paper, even years after the shelves were emptied. My days followed an easy pattern. I woke at the same time, made coffee the same way, sat by the same window, and watched the street wake up. Nothing about my routine felt fragile. It felt solid, dependable, earned. The building was quiet, but not empty. Sounds carried in a way that made you aware of other people without forcing you to think about them. A door closing somewhere below. Footsteps on the stairs. Water running through old pipes. It was the kind of background presence that fades into comfort if you live with it long enough. The first thing that stood out wasn't frightening. It was barely noticeable at all. One morning, as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed the light outside my door was already on. I was certain I'd turned it off the night before. I remember thinking, I must be misremembering. That happens more often than people like to admit. I didn't stop walking. I didn't slow down. I let the thought dissolve on its own. Days passed without anything else worth noting. My routine held steady. I worked, came home, cooked simple meals, slept deeply. When you're settled into a life like that, small inconsistencies feel more like dust than cracks. You brush them aside without thinking. A week later, I found one of my kitchen cabinets open when I came home. Just one, not wide, not dramatic, open by a few inches, like it had been forgotten. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at it, trying to remember if I'd reached for something that morning. Eventually, I closed it and went on with my evening. The explanation didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be possible. After that, little things began appearing with just enough regularity to be noticed. A chair slightly out of place. A book I didn't remember moving resting, face down instead of upright. My bathroom mirror fogged when I hadn't used hot water. Each detail arrived quietly, never demanding attention, never forcing me to react. I started paying closer attention without fully admitting it to myself. I took mental notes, not because I was afraid, but because I was curious. Curiosity feels safer than fear. It gives you the illusion of control. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. The light in the hallway was on again. This time, I knew I hadn't touched it. I stood still with my keys in my hand, listening. The building sounded the same as always. Nothing moved. Nothing announced itself. I turned the light off and unlocked my door. Inside, everything was as it should be. Too much so. That thought came to me uninvited, and once it did, it stayed. The apartment felt arranged. Not just tidy. Objects seemed deliberately placed, aligned with a care I didn't remember giving them. I began to notice patterns. The cabinet that opened on its own was always the same one. The chair that shifted was always angled toward the hallway, never away from it. The lights were only ever on in shared spaces, never in rooms where I spent time. None of it interfered with me directly. It felt observational, almost polite. I didn't tell anyone. There was nothing to tell. No single moment carried enough weight to justify explanation. Saying it out loud would have made it sound foolish, and foolishness has a way of turning quiet concerns into jokes. One night, I placed a small object on my entry table before going to bed. It was nothing special, just something light enough to move easily. I told myself I was testing the air, the building, my own assumptions. When I woke the next morning, it was still there, but rotated slightly, as if it had been turned to face the door. I stood over it for a long time. My thoughts slowed, not from panic, but from precision. I replayed my movements. I checked the windows. I looked for explanations that didn't require imagination. Everything I found pointed back to the same place, me. And yet the certainty refused to settle. From that point on, the changes became more consistent. Never faster, never louder, just more reliable. Every evening, something small would be different. Every morning, something would suggest I wasn't the last person to leave the room. I realized then that whatever was happening wasn't trying to hide. It was waiting for me to notice properly. After that realization settled in, I stopped pretending I wasn't paying attention. I didn't change my routine outwardly. I still woke at the same time, still left for work when I always had, still returned with the same unhurried steps. But internally, I was cataloging everything. Not obsessively, quietly. The way you listen more closely when a familiar room sounds slightly different. I began noticing how consistent the timing was. The changes never happened while I was present. They appeared only during the gaps in my day, the moments when the apartment was empty except for whatever remained behind. It felt deliberate, as if those intervals mattered. One evening, I delayed leaving. I stood in the hallway with my coat on, keys in hand, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The apartment remained inert, almost patient. When I finally left, I locked the door carefully, listening to the click echo through the corridor. When I returned hours later, the lock was untouched. Inside, the familiar adjustment was waiting for me. A cushion turned, a lamp angled just enough to notice. I stopped checking the time. I didn't want to reduce it to a schedule. I wanted to see it as it was, not as something predictable I could dismiss. Still, the regularity persisted. Every absence produced a change. Every presence produced nothing. At work, I caught myself thinking about how spaces behave when no one is watching them. We assume they pause, that rooms wait for us to return before continuing whatever invisible process they belong to. I began to understand that assumption was more fragile than I'd believed. I tested small boundaries. I left doors half open instead of closed. I placed objects in awkward positions, ones that felt unnatural, hoping they would remain untouched. When I came back, they were corrected, not hidden, not removed, just adjusted into something more orderly, more intentional. The adjustments never inconvenienced me. That was the most unsettling part. It wasn't disruptive. It didn't interfere with my comfort. It seemed invested in maintaining it. I tried staying awake once, sitting quietly in my living room, long past the time I would normally sleep. I didn't move. I didn't distract myself. I simply existed in the space, making myself undeniably present. Nothing changed. The apartment remained still, as if awareness itself imposed a rule. Eventually, I began to feel watched without feeling threatened. The sensation wasn't heavy. It was observational, like the awareness of standing near someone who is studying you without malice. I didn't feel hunted. I felt considered. One morning, I found something new. A note on my desk, not written, just a blank piece of paper, placed neatly where I usually set my phone. I knew I hadn't left it there. I also knew it wasn't a message. It was an acknowledgement. From then on, the changes grew more precise. Objects aligned with my habits before I completed them. The chair angled toward where I liked to sit. The book I had been thinking about rereading, placed closer to the edge of the shelf. The apartment wasn't reacting to my actions anymore. It was anticipating them. I understood then that whatever shared the space with me wasn't learning about the apartment. It was learning about me, and once that understanding formed, it didn't bring panic. It brought a quiet, steady awareness that my solitude had been an assumption, not a fact. After that awareness settled into me, my thoughts became more careful. Not fearful, just deliberate. I stopped testing the apartment. I stopped leaving objects out of place on purpose. It felt unnecessary, almost rude, as if I had already crossed a line simply by noticing. Days passed without escalation, and that was what made it harder to ignore. Nothing worsened, nothing retreated. The balance held, steady and calm. Like an agreement, neither of us had spoken aloud. I began to notice how my own behavior shifted. I started putting things back where they seemed to belong, even when I knew I hadn't moved them. I straightened objects instinctively, mirroring the same quiet corrections the apartment had been making. It wasn't conscious imitation. It felt like alignment. The sense of being observed didn't sharpen. It softened. It became familiar, like living near a window that always reflects a little more than it should. I didn't feel watched in moments of vulnerability, only in moments of decision. When I paused before choosing where to sit, which book to read, when to leave, there was a subtle pressure. Not pushing, just waiting. One evening, I arrived home to find the entryway arranged differently. Not dramatically, just enough to create a clear path from the door to the living room. Shoes aligned neatly against the wall. The small table shifted to widen the space. It looked thoughtful, considerate, as if the apartment wanted movement to feel easier. I stood there longer than usual, taking it in. The thought came slowly, without urgency. This place knew how I moved through it better than I did. I tried to recall when I had last felt truly alone inside it. The memory didn't come easily. Instead, I remembered moments I had overlooked. The way the space always felt prepared for me. The way disorder never lasted long. The way my discomfort never lingered. I started speaking aloud occasionally, not to ask questions. Just small acknowledgments, comments about the weather, about my day. The apartment didn't respond in any way I could measure, but the atmosphere felt attentive, as if sound itself was being registered and considered. Then, one morning, I noticed something missing. A small object I used every day was gone. Not misplaced, removed entirely. I searched calmly at first, retracing my steps, checking familiar surfaces. It didn't appear. When I gave up and left for work, I felt a faint sense of disappointment, as if something practical had been withdrawn. When I returned that evening, the object was back, placed exactly where my hand naturally reached for it. Clean, aligned, ready. I understood then that absence was also a kind of communication. From that point on, I stopped assuming my presence was the focus. It wasn't about whether I was there or not. It was about attention, awareness. The apartment responded when it was unobserved, but it learned when it was acknowledged. The realization didn't arrive as fear. It arrived as clarity. The space wasn't empty when I wasn't looking. It was active, observant, careful. I began to wonder how long it had been that way, waiting patiently for me to notice without ever demanding that I do. After that thought took hold, I stopped questioning my memories altogether. It no longer mattered whether I remembered doing something or not. What mattered was that the space remembered for me. The apartment began to feel less like a place I lived and more like a place that hosted me. It anticipated my needs with a quiet confidence. When I was tired, the room I rested in felt clearer, less cluttered. When my thoughts were restless, objects that distracted me seemed to disappear from view, tucked just out of sight without ever being truly gone. I noticed that my choices were becoming simpler, not because I was deciding less, but because fewer options presented themselves. I wore the clothes that were easiest to reach. I sat where the light fell most evenly. I followed paths through the apartment that felt natural, as if they had always been meant for me. I didn't resist it. Resistance would have required certainty, and certainty was something I no longer had. Instead, I paid attention. I allowed the patterns to continue forming around me, closing in gently, never abruptly. One evening, as I prepared to leave, I paused by the door, longer than usual. I had the distinct sense that leaving mattered more than it should have. Not urgently, not emotionally, just factually. Like stepping away from something mid-process. I hesitated, then stayed. Nothing happened immediately. The apartment didn't change while I watched it. But later, when I moved from room to room, I realized something subtle had shifted. The space felt tighter, not smaller, but more precise. Less wasted distance, less ambiguity. I understood then that my presence wasn't interrupting anything. It was completing it. The thought should have unsettled me more than it did. Instead, it felt explanatory, like finally understanding the purpose of a sound you'd heard for years without identifying. I stopped locking the door after that, not because I felt unsafe, but because the gesture felt unnecessary. The apartment didn't open itself to the outside. It curated what belonged inside. Sometimes I imagine what it must look like when I'm gone. Not empty, but attentive, waiting, adjusting, preparing for my return with the same care it always has. Other times, I wonder whether I ever truly leave at all, because even now, sitting wherever you're listening from, I can still picture the way my apartment holds itself when I'm not there. Calm, organized, patient, as if it knows exactly where I am. If you found this story engaging, liking the video helps support the channel and allows more listeners to discover this content. You're welcome to share the video with others who appreciate carefully paced, immersive narration. Feel free to leave your thoughts or interpretations in the comments below. And if you'd like to continue listening to future releases, consider subscribing and enabling notifications to stay updated.